Hey everybody, this is Darren Van Dam and you're watching Flick Connection, the show that helps you get more out of movies, and today we're going to be talking about the scariest stuff you can stream for Halloween this year. So this is going to be a list of 19 movies plus one new release horror series, and we're going to be talking about things on 4 different platforms. In order, we're going to go through HBO Max, Prime Video, Netflix, and Hulu, talking about the top 5 scariest things, mostly movies, you can watch this Halloween. I will be coming out with more than one horror list. It's going to be packed with hidden gem horror movies that you've probably never heard of, so stay tuned for that. But with that, let's start this list off with my HBO Max picks, beginning with 28 Days Later. Released in 2002, 28 Days Later reinvigorated the zombie genre, a genre that had largely faded out as we went into the late 90s, and this really recharged it, not just because the zombies could run fast, although that had a lot to do with it, but because this was so well written and produced. Academy Award winner Danny Boyle directed this, and I think directed the hell out of it. It's done really well, but also done with digital cameras, so it's got that grainy look to it, and it feels sort of immediate and fast, like everything's sort of happening too fast for the filmmakers to keep up. That was brilliant, and it's also just a really good script from Alex Garland, who would go on to create some amazing works of sci-fi. He now is a writer-director who's done Annihilation, Ex Machina, and most recently the series Devs, which you can catch on FX and Hulu. But 28 Days Later is still one of the best zombie movies of all time because it is so successful in so many different areas. If it's been a while since you've watched it, you're gonna have a hard time finding a better zombie movie on HBO Max right now, except for the original Night of the Living Dead, which also makes this list.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Now, while 28 Days reinvigorated the zombie genre, Night of the Living Dead essentially invented it. While it wasn't the first zombie movie, it essentially established the template of what a zombie movie could be, how they function. The lore of them in cinema was largely created with George A. Romero's work here, and he would go on to do about a dozen zombie movies over his career, some of them quite good. I still think the first holds up as the best. Even though it's been remade, the first still, I think, works the best out of all of them. And not just because it's the first, it is a very good zombie movie. As old as it is now, it doesn't even quite feel that dated, but if you're looking to watch something a little more classic this Halloween, you're gonna be hard pressed to do better than Night of the Living Dead. Now, my next pick is actually 2 movies because the original Amityville Horror from 1979 and the 2005 remake are both available on HBO Max, and I actually recommend both. While I'm typically not a fan of remakes, not because I'm a movie snob, even though I might be, because they rarely do as good a job as the original, the Amityville Horror is a rare exception, especially in horror, where there's so many remakes that just don't work and are never as scary. The Ryan Reynolds 2005 remake is surprisingly chilling. With this, I recommend going whichever way you want. The 70s version obviously has that 70s vibe. It is the original, so there's a lot of reasons to watch that one, and it is a good classic horror movie. And then the remake actually also takes place in the 70s, yet it is shot more like a modern horror movie. It's very creepy, incredibly chilling, and Ryan Reynolds kills it in this, where you're normally seeing him do more funny roles. He's got an incredibly grim role here, and I think he literally kills it in this movie, so I do recommend watching, if not both, at least one or the other this Halloween. Next on the list is one of my favorites, if not my favorite horror movie of all time, The Shining.
Here's Johnny!
Now, I understand there's a lot of mixed feelings about this movie. While a lot of people do love it, and it is regarded as one of the best horror movies ever made, I also am acutely aware that Stephen King does not like it. He doesn't feel like it's a good adaptation of his work, and I can understand that as well. But Stanley Kubrick did something so different with this movie, which is why I like it so much. On the surface, Plot-wise, it does sound like kind of your standard horror movie fare, but the way that this movie was filmed with so many little subliminal messages and things, the creep factor is just dialed up to 11 with The Shining, especially if you're tuned into it and you're really paying attention to a lot of little details that you might normally miss, which makes The Shining incredibly rewatchable for a horror movie as well. If you think about modern horror movies, they're good for a watch, maybe two, but after having seen it, the scares are gone and it's not as exciting. The Shining is a movie you can watch and rewatch and find new things in it every single time, and they're clever, creepy things as well, things that are hidden way under the surface, so that is why I love The Shining. But if you want a creepy movie that's got a lot more blood and guts in it than you get from The Shining, or really any of the ones that I've talked about so far, then I recommend checking out Event Horizon. Now this one does have a cult following. In fact, this movie is much more popular today than it was back when it came out. Second to Alien, this might be one of the best space horror movies ever made. It's got jump scares, blood, guts, incredible sets at times, and just an overall wildness to it, sort of an H.P. Lovecraft type thing that really gets out of hand, quite frankly, but that's also what makes this movie so good and so enjoyable and rewatchable. But if you've never seen Event Horizon and you want to watch something particularly terrifying this Halloween, turn the lights off and check it out on HBO Max this year. Now we're going to move on to Prime Video, which is one of my favorite streaming services for Halloween this year because they have so much to choose from. The only problem is it can be very hard to find on Prime Video. So here are the 5 scariest movies I could find on Prime Video, and then I will be back later this week with a bunch of hidden gems that you will likely not find without me pointing them out. So stay tuned for that video. But right now, this list includes The Lighthouse. So this is one of the newer releases. It's only a couple of years old and was a big hit in the indie circuit when it came out. This is from the same director as The Witch and is an art film. This is less of a horror movie than an art film, but if you get into it, this movie can be incredibly terrifying. Maybe not so much after the credits roll, but during, it is just an awful thing to behold at times. This is about a couple of lighthouse attendants stranded on an island, yet it's about so much more. If you think the weirder the better when it comes to movies, then The Lighthouse is going to be for you. There's a good chance you've probably already seen it, but it could make an incredible Halloween watch because it is one of the creepiest things you can currently catch on Prime Video. Fair warning though, if you typically do not like extremely weird movies, The Lighthouse is probably not going to be for you. Now, one that's still weird but that will appeal to a broader audience is one from the 80s called Angel Heart. This actually stars Mickey Rourke before he disappeared for a while, and Robert De Niro. In this movie, Mickey Rourke plays a detective in New Orleans, and it's got an incredible look to it. It's got a great New Orleans vibe, it's dark, it's grungy, he's always in this sort of like underbelly of the city investigating a crime, and this is a pretty horrific movie. It can be bloody and gruesome at times, and it can really catch you off guard with that at times as well, because it's good at lulling you into thinking you're watching a detective movie when you're really watching a pretty horrifying horror movie, especially if you tune into it and you realize what's going on. This one's got some really dark elements to it, so be warned on that. But for one that came out in the 80s, it still holds up today. It's far from one of the best, but it's certainly one of the more interesting ones that is still sort of relevant today. Released the exact same year as Angel Heart, 1987, is Clive Barker's classic Hellraiser. This is a perfect Halloween movie to watch and can be incredibly chilling, especially if you get into it. Some of the effects are a little dated, but still, the costume design and everything in this movie is incredibly clever, and it stands out again. When you're looking at classic monster movies and things, particularly from the 80s, a lot come to mind: Freddy Krueger, Jason, but Pinhead from Hellraiser is certainly one of the more interesting ones, and this movie does a good job of standing on its own. They continue to make sequels to this. I find the first to be the best, and as good as it is, it's not even Clive Barker's best, but it's up there. It's certainly his most famous. I'm particularly partial to Nightbreed myself, but Hellraiser is a damn good watch. If you consider yourself a movie buff and you've never seen Hellraiser, make 2021 the year that you watch it. Now, another recent release on the list is Ari Aster's Midsommar. Now this is another one that's for people who like weird movies, but it's this incredibly creepy movie. It does take a long time getting into it. It's fairly slow paced throughout, but has some beautiful cinematography in it for a horror movie. It's one of the most beautiful horror movies I think I've ever seen, and that's part of what's so brilliant about it, is that you cannot see the horror that's lying underneath until you get pretty far into the film. But it also brings new meaning to psychological horror. This is done on a different level. There's a psychedelic element to it that I think works really well for this story. The performances are fantastic, and while it's not necessarily the scariest one on this list, if you wrap your head around it the right way, it can be horrifying. Another one that is not for everybody, but if you tend to like stuff produced by A24, things like The Lighthouse and The Witch, then this is going to be the movie for you. Odds are you've seen it, but if for some reason you put it off and didn't want to check this one out, I highly recommend it, as long as you're not averse to slower paced art films. But if that's not for you, I do have another classic that is terrifying and broadly appealing with The Descent. Now this is about a group of girls that go spelunking in some caves, and while this one does take a while getting in, once it kicks off, it does not stop. This one was a kind of a surprise hit. It's a fairly simple movie. As you can tell, there's not much going on. It's just girls in a cave, but back when this came out, people loved it. They made a sequel that I think is just as good. Some people would argue with me about that, but the first one does a good job of standing alone on its own. If you want to be creeped the hell out, again, turn the lights off, watch this one by yourself. You will not be disappointed. Now, before jumping into my Netflix and Hulu recommendations, I do want to tell you about today's sponsor, CyberGhost VPN, because depending on where you are in the world, you may not have access to all of the movies I'm talking about in this video, or if you're in the future, maybe you caught this video by chance long after Halloween 2021, all of these movies are not going to be available where I say they are. By the way, the full list is in the top pinned comment down below, along with a link to CyberGhost, which keeps your web browsing safe, secure, and private, but they also have specialized servers for all of these streaming services in a variety of countries, which means you can disguise your computer or smart TV or wherever you watch movies, you can disguise it to look as if it's in a different country and immediately access the same streaming services you're already paying for as if you're in almost any country in the world, which means you can open up vast new libraries, giving you access to way more movies and shows than you could ever possibly hope to watch. And right now, my viewers can pay as low as $2.19 a month. That's less than half the cost of one new release movie rental to, again, unlock way more movies and shows than you could ever hope to watch. CyberGhost is super easy to use, and they offer you a 45-day money-back guarantee, which I know for a fact they will honor. They also have great 24/7 customer support, so they're there to help you get it set up on multiple devices, because you're going to be able to use it on 7 different devices at the same time, but it's all the different types of devices you're already using to stream movies. So again, go to the link in the description or the top pinned comment. Pay as low as $2.19 to access way more movies and shows. But speaking of movies and shows, let's move on with the rest of this list. All right, now we're moving on to Netflix, where they have one of the scariest home invasion movies of all time, The Strangers. And I personally find home invasion movies to be particularly terrifying because they're one of the more realistic things that could actually happen to you in your life as far as things seen in horror movies go. But The Strangers works. It's incredibly creepy. The story, there's not much of one, and that's kind of what works about this one. It's more of like watching an event unfold with a little bit of story underneath, but you're really kind of just with this couple going through this terrifying event. It's shot really well. Obviously they made a sequel, but I think the original is incredibly creepy. It works really well and is one of the scarier things currently available on Netflix right now. And I can say the same thing about Sinister. While this one's more supernatural, it's incredibly creepy. While I don't really think this is a great horror movie, it goes for sort of some cheap scares at times, creepy sounds, creepy masks, jump scares. It does do all of those things really well. The creep factor again here is really just dialed up to 11. If you let yourself get into this one, especially if you're watching it in the dark alone, the sounds and visuals in this one are gonna creep the hell out of you, even if the story itself doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I've got another zombie movie on this list that gets big points just again for being different and familiar at the same time. I'm talking about Ravenous, which is a Canadian zombie movie that's only a few years old now. And this one has a lot in common with The Walking Dead. You're with sort of this band of strangers that have met each other along the road and are just trying to survive a zombie apocalypse. And again, as always with good zombie movies, they do something a little bit different. There's sort of something that the zombies do in this movie that I found interesting, but mostly you're just terrified for the people that you're following. Very similar to Night of the Living Dead, this one feels original and fresh, but also feels somewhat real. It feels like you're watching a real event unfold. I liked that aspect of it. This is far from the scariest one on this list, but as far as zombie movies currently available on streaming, this is one of the best. Now, far and away, the most underrated movie on this list, and possibly one of the most underrated horror movies of all time, and yes, I realize that is a bold statement, is William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist 3. Now, Blatty actually wrote the original The Exorcist, but the movie was directed by William Friedkin, who is an Academy Award-winning director. He directed movies like The French Connection, but Blatty is not really a director, and this movie was kind of panned when it was released, but over time it has really grown an audience, and what has happened here is it's an almost true adaptation of Blatty's work, with the exception that they insisted on having sort of some big finale that rivaled the original The Exorcist, which didn't quite fit with the movie, yet it's not a deal breaker either. This movie has some incredible moments in it and is very different from The Exorcist. This movie actually has a lot more in common with a movie like Seven. Now, it's not filmed as cool as Seven was or anything like that, but it's more of an investigation into a really horrific series of murders with a lot of interesting elements behind them. I loved that aspect of this movie. George C. Scott gives an incredible performance in something like this, and the movie is kind of funny and silly at times when it's appropriate. The best way to go into The Exorcist 3 is to have little to no expectations outside of what I've just said, and to not compare it to the original. That may seem like an obvious statement, but they are very, very different movies and should be taken in as such. Even though the studio tried to make them similar, they still do stand out from one another. But The Exorcist 3, trust me, if you've never seen it, it is an absolute gem that deserves to be watched. And I'm going to wrap up the Netflix portion of this video with their latest horror series, Midnight Mass. This is from Mike Flanagan, who over the past few years has also done The Haunting of Hill House and The Haunting of Bly Manor. I personally loved Midnight Mass. I've liked a lot of his movies as well, but Midnight Mass was incredibly clever for a series. I felt like the story was incredibly cohesive, and while it's not overall one of the scariest things I've ever seen, there are moments in it that are incredibly effective, and I felt like there were plenty of moments where I was watching something as good as the original The Exorcist. And while there's a lot of themes of religion in this show, I do think that the horror metaphor here is ultimately sort of a warning in blind belief, not just in the Catholic Church and not even just in religion. Putting blind faith into almost anything, it shows you some of the dangers with that, and I think it does a really good job with that. It also just surprised me. It's incredibly clever and unique. It is 10 episodes. It's 10 long hours to get through, but I blew through it incredibly quickly. I found it to be one of the more interesting things Netflix has put out in recent months. And with that, we're gonna go to Hulu, which does have a good selection, but be warned, they also have a lot of really terrible movies. And I don't just mean bad horror movies. I mean ones that are Hulu originals that are almost not even movies. They're really half-assed, so be wary of those, just going in and picking things that look cool. But here are my top 5 picks of the scariest movies on Hulu right now, starting with Signs, which I think is maybe the least scary movie on this list, but still, I remember seeing this in the theater and being thoroughly creeped out, not just by the end, which is an incredible climax, but there's several moments in the movie that were incredibly chilling. Now, it is a little dated today, and having seen it a few times, the scare factor has worn off, but if it's been a while and you remember really enjoying this one, you could easily get back into it on Hulu right now. Now, one of the most stomach-turning movies on this list is The House That Jack Built. The House That Jack Built has a lot in common with the 80s classic Henry, starring Michael Rooker, because you're kind of going along for the ride with the killer. You're not really seeing anything from the point of view of the victim, and the movie is essentially a chronicle of this serial killer's most life-altering kills. It's creepy stuff, and there's quite a variety. There's some really grim kills, there's some moments that are darkly funny, and then this movie just goes into a really bizarre direction. Again, if you're of the mind that the weirder the better, which I personally am, you're gonna love The House That Jack Built. If you don't like super weird, offbeat movies at all, stay away from this one because you're gonna hate it. But if that piques your interest and you have not seen it yet, this is gonna be a great Halloween watch for you this year. One of the most interesting slasher movies to have come out in the last 10 years is exactly 10 years old this Halloween. I'm talking about You're Next.
What is that?
Similar to The Strangers, in this movie a family are attacked by some masked people from outside. Again, you get the home invasion element. This is an incredibly bloody, graphic movie, but it also takes a turn early on and kind of becomes an action horror movie as well. I was incredibly surprised by that aspect in this movie. I expected to kind of see the same thing I had seen multiple times before, and You're Next delivered something different that I absolutely loved. If you've never watched this one, while it is scary and it is a good bloody horror movie, it's also one of the more fun ones featured on this list. I personally love horror anthology movies, but this list only features one, and it's one of the scarier ones I've seen in recent years. It is only available on Hulu right now, and it is called Ghost Stories. Like all anthologies, this is about 4 or so different stories. They're all dark and incredibly creepy, but the way that they are threaded together in Ghost Stories is what makes this one stand out. You've also got a really good performance from Martin Freeman. You normally see him in more comedic roles. He does a fantastic job in this movie, but there's also just some really creepy visuals and great little stories. The small stories are really good, but again, the overarching one that ties everything together surprised me as to how good it was. They're normally not that good in anthology movies, and Ghost Stories stood out to me because of that. Then finally, we're going to end with one of the creepiest movies I've seen in recent years. Not necessarily the scariest, but most spine-tingling for sure. Saint Maud. Now this one is really weird. It's also very slow paced, but if you get into it and you realize kind of what's going on, almost every single shot in this movie has something to say. It illustrates the isolation of the main character, and all of those elements sort of stack up to tell you what's actually going on. Now, I know that a lot of people did not like this movie. I think Saint Maud does require quite a bit from the viewer. It's not going to let you sit there and just be scared. You do have to try to figure out what's actually going on with this Maud character for it to become really creepy. I think if you miss it, and you can miss it, the movie's not nearly as interesting, but if you catch kind of why things are happening the way they're happening, this is incredibly effective, creepy horror. It's one of the more interesting things I've seen in the last couple of years. If you typically like my recommendations, this is going to be a good Halloween watch. Even if it's not your new favorite horror movie or anything like that, the creep factor on this one is definitely going to get you. But let me know in the comments below if there's anything scary on streaming services that I missed in this list, and be sure to stay tuned for my hidden gem list coming up soon. Also, help me thank the Patreon supporters. If you're interested in becoming a Patreon supporter, there's a link in the description below. It's a good way to support the channel. You could also become a channel member and get access to exclusive videos right here on YouTube. But I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this horror list, and I'll be back with more real soon.